The answer seems to be in simplicity and eating less diversity, because we're talking about all these different plant toxins, different toxins in different animals, and it gets really complex really quickly. And for people, at least early on, if they're just learning about all this, the solution is to narrow your diet down and eat more simply. And throughout this conversation, we've already talked about the ruminant animals, but we're going to give you the template. And then over time, if you want to get fancy, you can learn about different plant toxins. And like you talked about before, fermenting, cooking, different things we can do to remove some of those. But in the beginning, the only answer I can really give to people is keep it simple while you're learning. And then you're going to be getting the nutrition you need and minimizing all these toxins.
I love that perspective. I think there's so much power in simplicity in our diets, and we can foreshadow this or give people a little bit of a blueprint now. I don't think everyone needs to eat an animal-based diet, but that's just a way of eating that I've sort of found to be helpful for me and a lot of people. And that is just a term that I think happened when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I think of it basically an animal-based diet is a little bit like Carnivore 2.0. We all learn and evolve. And I've changed my perspective since I was a carnivore dieter. I've been eating animal-based for about 4 years. Animal-based is basically meat and fruit. That's the simplest way to say it. And we talked a little bit about leaves and seeds earlier, and a little bit about roots with cassava. But when you look at the dichotomy or the distinction between the vegetable parts of plants, which are the leaves, stems, roots, and seeds, versus the fruit, there's a big difference in terms of defense chemicals. Not all fruit is completely free of defense chemicals, and we know that when a fruit ripens, the defense chemicals in the fruit decrease. So if plants also don't want you eating unripe fruit, you can see defense chemicals in unripe fruit that lessen as the fruit ripens, interestingly. Fruit is a plant's colorful, sweet intention to us to move their seeds somewhere else. And so fruit has a lot less of these problems in it. Some fruit has oxalates. Raspberries, blackberries are not free of oxalates. They're moderate, actually, because they have so many seeds in them. Even things like kiwi can have a moderate amount of oxalates. The data is out on dates. There's sort of conflicting data on whether dates have a significant amount of oxalates. But in general, fruit, I would say, has much, much lower levels of defense chemicals. There's no significant impact from phytic acid in fruit. There are no major isothiocyanates or iodine inhibitors in fruit. These things like saponins, these digestive enzyme, like problematic compounds for digestive enzymes, these gut irritating compounds like saponins don't occur in ripe fruit. So now, the other thing I'll say with regard to fruit is there are many foods we think of as vegetables that are actually fruit, things like avocado or squash. So when you're thinking fruit, you're thinking blueberries, strawberries, banana, apples, whatever seasonal where you are, but also pumpkins, spaghetti squash, kabocha squash, zucchini, cucumber, avocado. These are all fruit. Anything that has seeds in it is a fruit. So I think there is a very sustainable, simple, easy diet for most people that is meat and fruit for some amount of time to see how this affects your overall symptoms, whether those symptoms be all of the ones we listed earlier, and then gradual introduction of the foods that you're missing most. That might be vegetables. And I love that you foreshadowed this. We can talk a little bit about the fact that humans are resourceful and there are ways to partially or mostly detoxify the vegetable foods, which are traditional in nature. You look at the way that hunter-gatherer humans and indigenous populations of humans that eat some of these, quote, vegetable foods, they don't do it the way we do it. They don't just boil beans, right? They ferment beans for days. They don't just boil quinoa. Like I said earlier, they ferment quinoa. They do these processes. They make things like kimchi or sauerkraut. They ferment the cabbage. Well, guess what? Fermentation degrades isothiocyanates in cabbage. Cabbage is a brassica. It's part of that mustard family with kale. So if you really wanted to eat kale, you could ferment some kale in a sauerkraut with your cabbage, and that would have much, much lower amounts of these things. But to just eat those foods without attention to the potential negative impacts causes issues for a lot of people. Not everyone, but a lot of people.
One of the things that comes up for me when you bring up fruit is the domestication and changes in fruit from, say, what it would be 1,000 years ago to what we have access to today. And you would be the one to know better on this, obviously living in Costa Rica. I would assume you have access to fruit that's more in its natural form compared to what we can get over here in Canada and the US. But talk about how you think about that perspective where fruits in a general sense have gotten bigger, higher sugar content. They're not the fruits that our ancestors would have eaten.
So this is an interesting thing for me. There are many fruits that we still can encounter today, generally in tropical areas, that are essentially unchanged from the way they were historically. There's all sorts of mangoes here in Costa Rica, jackfruit, very, very sweet things that have not really been hybridized or changed. So the notion that fruit was never large or sweet or full of sugar is just incorrect. It is true that some fruits like apples or pears, but also almonds, bananas have been hybridized and grafted and sort of intentionally raised to be bigger and sweeter. And when we look at the research, I don't think that's a problem for humans at all. I've still never seen a study, and if anyone in your audience has access to the study, I would gladly read it and share it. I've never seen a study where humans were given in a controlled setting an apple, even the way it looks today, or a banana, or blueberries of today, and we see major negative effects. And in fact, we consistently see the opposite. And again, I'll just say that this is a place where I've learned a lot since my carnivore days. And I mean, I've gone deep down the rabbit hole regarding fruit juice. Because there's a lot of people today that vilify fruit juice and they say, no, without the fiber, fruit isn't healthy for you. Well, there's about 25 randomized controlled trials that would directly argue with that position that none of these folks ever cite. I mean, whether you're talking about orange juice, blood orange juice, pineapple juice, apple juice, or blueberry juice, cherry juice, grape juice, watermelon juice, these have all been studied in humans. And invariably, they seem to have positive effects. There's even a study where people were given watermelon juice in the setting of an oral glucose tolerance test. So an OGTT is where people are given a liquid that looks like cola, it's gross, of pure glucose. Generally, this is done in pregnancy, but sometimes it's done in research settings. So they're handing you a glass, and it looks like soda, of pure glucose. And I think we could check this. I think it's 90 grams. It's a significant amount of pure glucose. And they look to see how your body responds to pure glucose, something that doesn't occur in nature. Pure fructose doesn't occur in nature either. And when they gave watermelon juice with an oral glucose tolerance test, people's insulin sensitivity was better. So they gave people more sugar in the form of watermelon juice, and they did better on an OGTT. Cherry juice, orange juice, blood orange juice, these have all been studied. Decreased lipid peroxidation, decreased DNA damage, decreased oxidative stress at the cell level. People know about pomegranate juice, a lot of the same outcomes. So I would challenge people listening to this to find a study in humans where fruit juice is given and we see negative effects. And these are not ancestral versions, right? This is a normal today's 2024 or whenever the study was done, 2016 pomegranate. It's normal watermelon of today, right? It's a normal apple of today making the apple juice. It's a normal grape of today making grape juice. And so, yes, it's true some of these foods have been changed. And I think that doesn't translate into negative effects in humans that I've ever seen in the medical literature or myself. And yes, being at the equator, there are lots of fruit here that has never really been hybridized. And in its, quote, original state is super sweet and plentiful. The best example of this might be honey, which is an interesting analogy because honey is honey. We haven't made honey sweeter. Bees always make honey to be full of sugar, and it's full of glucose and fructose together. But if you look in humans, there's multiple studies that show health benefits to humans. And yes, it raises your blood sugar, but that actually doesn't look to be bad for us. And we can talk about that what I believe is a conflation there. I don't think raising your blood sugar after a meal that contains honey, preferably raw and organic, or fruit juice is bad for humans in any way, shape, or form. If you have diabetes, you're going to be more sensitive to that. And your metabolic machinery is a little broken and you don't process sugar very well. And yeah, your blood sugar could go up very dangerously high. And we can talk about how to mitigate that. But it's important that I state this very clearly, and I'll draw the line in the sand. Fruit juice, and honey do not cause diabetes. They don't cause humans to become less metabolically healthy. In fact, the research would argue they allow us to become more metabolically healthy. And there's even a randomized controlled trials where honey was given to diabetics up to 125 grams a day, and it improved metrics of glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. It raised their blood sugar a little bit. Their hemoglobin A1C went up slightly. I think the average increase in overall blood sugar in a 90-day period was 7 to 10 milligrams per deciliter versus a no honey group, but their tolerance of glucose got better. So yes, if you eat sugar, yes, if you eat fruit, yes, if you eat sugar in the form of honey, I should say, if you eat fruit juice and you're diabetic, your blood sugar will go up. That doesn't mean your diabetes is getting worse. It may mean that it's not the most prudent thing to do without being aware of the amount of sugar and honey and fruit that you're eating as a diabetic, and those probably aren't your first foods to go to. But those foods did not make you diabetic. That's really, really important to say, and I would love to debate anyone who feels differently, because glucose goddess, come at me. Like, I'm waiting for her. She won't have the conversation.
Well, when she was on my show talking about honey, she actually said that honey is worse for you than white sugar.
Crazy.
Because the fructose content is higher in honey versus white sugar.
We message on Instagram, Glucose Goddess, and I have asked her to come on the podcast and have friendly, respectful debate multiple times, and she never does it. So she's wrong, in my strong opinion here. She's making this up. There's no studies that show that honey is worse for you than white sugar. Some honey does have more fructose than glucose, and no big deal. And I'll tell you why. So fructose is getting a really bad rap right now, and I think incorrectly. If someone is saying that fructose is bad for you, they are invariably, and I'll be fairly strong in these words because this is frustrating for me. They are invariably citing animal studies in mice and rats who have completely different biochemistry than with regard to humans in terms of de novo lipogenesis. Humans convert a very, very small amount of fructose in our diets to fat, which is de novo lipogenesis, like less than 1% or around 1%. Mice and rats do far, far more than that. So you're talking about, less than 1% is nothing. We convert most of the fructose in our diet to glucose, to glycogen, to glycerol. Glucose, glycogen, and lactate are the big sort of downstream metabolites of fructose. Like, we don't convert this to fat, anything like a mouse or a rat. The other studies that are done on fructose feed pure fructose, and that never occurs in nature. When you have fructose in the gut without glucose, you get malabsorption. And when you get fructose malabsorption, you get overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria and increases in lipid polysaccharide, which is also known as endotoxin. So that's really important, because when you give animals a compound that blocks the downstream effects of endotoxin, fructose doesn't look harmful anymore. Because when you're feeding fructose to an animal, they're also getting overgrowth of bacteria and converting more of it to fat with different biochemistry than us. But you can do this in humans too. You can give something that blocks TLR4 receptors, toll-like receptor 4, toll-like receptor 4, and that's the downstream sort of target of endotoxin. And so what's going on with fructose is overgrowth of the wrong type of bacteria in the gut from isolated fructose feeding. You don't malabsorb fructose when you consume it with glucose. It's a co-transporter. It's a symporter in the gut. So we don't get overgrowth. And fruit and honey contain compounds that also minimize or completely inhibit the absorption. Fruit and honey contain compounds that inhibit the overgrowth of bacteria in our gut. So polyphenols actually mitigate any of this bacterial overgrowth. You don't get endotoxin being released or endotoxin increasing in humans when you eat fruit, when you eat honey, when you eat fruit juice. But if you feed pure fructose, you do, because it's malabsorption. So this is frustrating for me. It's kind of mirroring a lot of things in nutrition. You can't take a reductionist lens and say fructose is bad because when we give you fructose, you don't do well. Well, that doesn't occur in nature. And it's impossible in nature to get glucose or fructose without polyphenols, without other compounds in honey. Honey has 300 plus compounds that we haven't even characterized. Some of which may be polyphenolic, some of them are not polyphenolic, but there's a lot going on here. It's much more complicated than a lot of people in the health spaces are making it out to be. And that's frustrating for me, because my concern here is that the consumer is just sort of throwing their hands up and is saying, Paul tells me vegetables are bad. Glucose Goddess tells me fruit is bad. Fruit juice is bad and honey is bad. This guy over here tells me meat is bad. Paul is now telling me chicken and pork are bad and fish is bad. There's nothing to eat. Therefore, all of these people are full of it. And look, I get that perspective, but I want people to understand that there's more nuance there, and perhaps explain my reasoning for feeling this way better than other people, or substantiate it with actual research, because I've never seen glucose goddess, whose name is Jessie, actually show any research to back this claim? And if you look on her website, there's certainly nothing there.
Well, another layer onto this too, you talked about everybody having different opinions that are conflicting and the consumer being so confused, and I agree with that, is that even the influencers, including yourself, are changing their mind at times. So in all fairness, it's not just that different influencers have different opinions. Different opinions are changing, which in my mind, that's a credible thing. You should continue to learn and continue to evolve, but it does add to the confusion and frustration for the end users.
I agree with you. I think it is a sign of critical thinking when people change their mind on things. And I've certainly changed my mind and evolved my perspective on a few things, fructose being one of them, as I learned more. And so I think as a health consumer, it would be better to follow or listening to people who are evolving. Everyone listening to this knows that they've changed their mind and evolved their perspective on things in the past. So I think it's okay. And I respect that that's difficult for people, because it is hard when you follow someone or a series of ideas and those ideas shift. But I think that's a good thing in general, and not to be, I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing long term. I think it's a good thing. And in my experience, there are some folks in the health space that have never changed their ideas ever, and others who have. And I like consuming content more from people who have changed their perspective.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
Excess linoleic acid in the human diet leads to excess linoleic acid in human cell membranes. And that creates an oxidative liability for us. It puts extra stress on the body. It's sort of like having extra dry wood around your cabin in the mountains and always running your wood burning stove. And